Welcome back to my Slovakia ancestry adventure. This is part 4, Harichovce, the story of Maria Ševčík, born 1865. As usual, a sign confirms our entry into the village proper. We begin by following our way along the Lavochki brook that flows from the north into the heart of the village. Meanwhile, another look at my family tree shows my paternal great-grandparents and one pair of my maternal great-great-grandparents who came from the Slovak lands to the United States. Today we'll focus on Maria Ševčík. The first surviving records for Harichovce are from the 1200s. At that time, many German immigrants were coming into the Kingdom of Hungary. We'll talk more about that in the final episode of the series. The first leader of the Harichovce settlers was named Valdemar, which transformed into Baldmar. In his honor, eventually the village took the name of Palmsdorf, Dorf being the German word for village. By the 1500s, more Slovaks were settling in the area, and another name took hold, first written as Harichovce, and subsequently written in many different ways. It's not clear, to me anyway, if these two different village name forms are related, as we saw with the Harho and Gergő connection in the previous episode, but it is interesting to note that in Hungarian both name forms were used over time. As we approach the village center, let's review the population data, which shows just under 1,900 people living in the village per the 2022 data. Over our focus range of 1880 to 1910, there was actually a bit of growth in the village population until the last decade, where there was around a 10% dip. This is the Church of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, constructed in its current basic form in 1764, with alterations in the 1800s, after a flood destroyed the earlier 13th century church on roughly the same site. A lot has happened in this church that is of importance in my family's story. On January 9, 1865, a girl named Maria, born just the day before, was baptized. Her parents were called Stefanus Ševčík and Anna Chui. They lived in Harichovce as it was written at the time, and their house number was 82. Here's a scattering of what I've seen written for the Ševčík name in various documents from the period, often with many variations applied to the same individual over time. The modern form is typically written as you see in the bottom right. We saw in Maria's baptism record that house number 82 was referenced, and as always, when we see this kind of information, we dive into other available records from the period to find out more about it. We are fortunate in this case to have both a land book and a village map from 1865, the year that Maria was born. The land book shows us, in the Hungarian language, that János Ševčík owned house number 82, which is plot 34. As we zoom out, we also see the list of all his land holdings in the village, including farmlands. The land book also shows plot number 9 as house number 72, owned by István Ševčík, not the same person as the Stefanus Ševčík from Maria's baptism record. Now look at the old village map from the same year. Here is the church, the bridge, and the plots where houses 82 and 72 were located. As we blend into the modern scene, notice the church and the location of houses 82 and 72. Number 82 is just across the road from the church. This is a kind of double lot with two houses. From another angle, we see those two houses, then pan over to the little modern parking area, which in the 1860s contained a garden area also owned by the Ševčík family. This alternate map from 1870 indicates that the main plot was somehow subdivided, with an indication of a second building either planned or in construction, matching with our visual observation. Across from that, there was the garden area, with a small structure indicated. While the basic village layout from the maps is strikingly recognizable in the aerial views of today, some of the relics of the past have no remaining traces, such as this location of a barn that was shared between the land-owning peasants, and this location of the blacksmith shop. In the meantime, recall from Part 3 that Jan Fefra was making the village-hopping journey of his youth, and by the early 1870s was living in Domanice, just a few hills to the east of Harichovce. I found no records that indicate exactly when or why he made his way to Harichovce, but we know for certain he was there by 1886. This marriage record shows that on January 25th of that year, Jan Fefra, a native of Gerger and lately living in Palmafalu, again another name form for Harichovce, married Maria Shevchik, the daughter of Stefanos. One more look at houses 82 and 72 in today's view. We'll now dive down to look inside the church. This church is for the most part modestly decorated. It has some wonderful ceiling paintings depicting various biblical scenes. The altar is a 20th century production. I was able to walk up to the organ gallery for this view of the small but pretty church. This baptismal font is from the early 1800s. Here, my great-grandmother Maria Shevchik was baptized in 1865. Jan Fefra and Maria's first son, also named Jan Fefra, was baptized here in 1887. Their second son, Michal, in 1888, and a daughter, Maria, in 1891. Unfortunately, baby Maria died later in 1891. Harichovce baptism records also indicate that Jan and Maria Fefra were godparents to another child in May of 1891. Sometime after this, exactly when is uncertain, Jan Fefra came to the United States. Maria and their first two boys would not follow until about 8 years later in 1900. The timing is uncertain because none of their immigration records or ship's passage logs seem to be preserved. In Part 2 of this series, I mentioned the American Industrial Revolution as an enabler for the Slovaks and many other Europeans to come to the United States. With that in mind, let's start to explore where my ancestors moved to. Here is the little town of Marguerite, Pennsylvania. This is what was called a patch town. It was created adjacent to a coal mine, specifically to house workers in the coal industry. This is what it looked like in the early 1900s. Here is a USGS map of Marguerite from 1902. Just a little patch of houses and this string of features labeled coke ovens. Here's an aerial view from a little bit later in the 1940s. Here's the patch. There's also evidence of the two mines that were in service at one time or another. And here are the rows of coke ovens. Up above the patch is the church that was built in the early 1900s, St. Benedict, which still serves the community today. So what's all this about coke ovens? By the early 1880s, coal had overtaken wood as America's primary fuel source. The coal industry was doubling output volume about every decade or so. In addition to heating homes and fueling factories, coal from this area had a special purpose. It fed the burgeoning steel industry that was also rapidly expanding in the Pittsburgh area. Before we dig too much deeper into the coal pile, let's peek at the 1900 U.S. Census record, which is the first record of Jan Fefra, now called John Novotny, in the United States. It appears that in conjunction with his coming to the USA, he chose to adopt the name of his mother and his uncle, in whose household he was raised. He believed that he was more a part of the Novotny family than his birth family. The transition to the United States was the opportunity for him to take on that name formally. People didn't carry a wallet or purse full of identifying documents back in those days, so although he might have been pigeonholed with the surname Fefra in the various villages of his childhood, he could establish his new identity without much friction in America. One other note of interest is that in 1900, before the arrival of Mary and their first two sons, John Novotny, coal miner, was listed as a boarder, living in the home of one Valiant Roach, which is a pretty cool sounding name, but his correct name was Valiant Roch. In the last episode, I mentioned that the Roch family would factor back into the story, and here's that connection. Jan Fefra's uncle, Jan Novotny, had a daughter, Maria, who was married to Michal Roch, and living with that family in Harichovce for the 1869 census. They later had a son, Valentinus, so when Jan Fefra came to America and became John Novotny, he lived, at least for a time, with the son of his cousin. Marguerite and dozens of other patch towns were formed in the Connellsville coal seam. This strip of land, up to 10 kilometers or 6 miles wide, and about 65 kilometers or 40 miles long, stretches in a band southeast of Pittsburgh. The Connellsville seam contains what's called bituminous coal, or soft coal. This type of coal, when processed into a form called coke, is especially great for steel making. Steel also helped drive the American Industrial Revolution, used for the railroads, building ships, for farm equipment, and as the support structure of the new skyscrapers. This set of coke ovens is in an obvious state of disrepair, but it is one of the few remaining fairly intact original set of coke ovens in this region. This is a small row of about 25 ovens, not too far from Marguerite, which at its peak had about 400 coke ovens. Each oven was filled with raw coke as taken directly from the mine, dumped in through this hole at the top. The coal was leveled off inside the oven and ignited by latent heat from the adjacent ovens. Then the front door was daubed with temporary brick and mortar to prevent the flow of oxygen into the chamber. After the allotted cook time, the front face of bricks was removed and the resulting coke quenched with huge quantities of water. Finally, the coke would be drawn out and loaded into rail cars for transportation to the steel mills. These coke ovens were known as beehive coke ovens because of the internal shape of the oven, which can be seen in this drawing and in the modern picture of a coke oven ruins. At peak, there were more than 100,000 beehive coke ovens in the U.S. Pennsylvania produced 3/4 of all American coke, and most of that came from the Connellsville coal seam. The coke processed in Marguerite and other patch towns would have been sent by rail to places like the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, shown in this USGS map. This steel mill opened in 1875, and it will tie into our next and final episode in the series. My family, like many Slovak families, came to the United States and became coal miners. Based on the records, this was without any prior experience. Many of the immigrants who worked in the coal mines and coke ovens were unskilled labor. In 1910, about half of all the coal miners in the U.S. were foreign-born. I mentioned that Maria Fefra, and now we should call her Mary Novotny, arrived in 1900 with sons John and Michael. By 1901, John and Mary Novotny had their next child in Marguerite, another son named Stephen, who would become my grandfather. In Marguerite, today there are no remnants of the coke ovens at all. They were all along the left side of this stream bank, and now they're completely gone. Let's look at one more historical document that will tie the first 4 episodes together. This is the 1931 marriage record of my grandfather, Stephen Michael Novotny, to my grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Roman. This record pulls together all the names we've seen so far. John Novotny, who was born Johannes Fefra, Mary Shevchik Novotny, Steve Roman, born Stefanos Ruman, and Anna Hardy Roman. After growing up, the Novotny children didn't all stay in Marguerite, but they didn't stray too far. Mike Novotny was a coal miner for a time, then turned to farming in Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania. The eldest son, John Novotny, lived in nearby Humphreys, another patch town. Here's a view of Humphreys from above. Up near the top of the slope was my great-uncle's property. This aerial view of Humphreys clearly shows the patch and the coke ovens. And the younger John Novotny was apparently enough of a bigwig in the little town to have the short road leading into the patch named in his honor. So we have a Novotny Road. Let's now turn back to Harichovce, because despite the hospitality and generosity I experienced in all the villages I visited, the family roots are living most of all here. Establishing these connections is where my guide Michal's help shone through most of all. In this lovely little back garden patio area, I spoke to a 4th cousin. She was also the former mayor of the village. We also contacted a local resident named Silvan, who by an astonishing coincidence has Slovak ancestors born in Marguerite, Pennsylvania, who later returned to Slovakia. We looked at many photos together. I don't know who most of these people are, but they reinforce the joy of capturing and preserving our past, and illustrate that these folks have a sense of humor. I also had the opportunity to meet the current mayor of Harichovce, a special surprise for which I'm grateful. Not all these people are even related to me, but they all welcomed me with open arms to discuss my past and see if they could help piece the puzzle together. The spirit of the Shevchik family is alive and well today in Harichovce. As we rise high and take one more view of the church, I thank you for your time once again and remind you there is one more episode to round out our series. Next time we will visit Vyshny Medzev. Thanks and see you then.